In this video, we will explore the downfall of one of the greatest empires. We will be looking into the Roman Empire and what caused it. If you enjoy these videos, please feel free to leave a like and or subscribe to help the channel grow. Now let's begin. We are going to spend some time there tonight, in the long, slow twilight of that great empire, not in the noise and chaos of battle, but in the quieter moments in between. The candlelit rooms, the marble corridors, the dusty road stretching toward a horizon that seemed, once upon a time, to have no end. This is not a story of sharp, sudden collapse. Empires rarely fall that way. Instead, this is a story of slow things, of seasons changing almost imperceptibly, of a great machine growing old, its parts wearing down one by one, of something vast and magnificent, gradually, gently, letting go. Let your body sink a little deeper now. Feel the weight of your arms, the warmth of wherever you're lying, and breathe out slowly. Good. We begin not at the end, but just before the middle in the 3rd century after the birth of Christ. The year is perhaps 235 or 240. The exact number doesn't matter much tonight. What matters is the feeling of the age. Rome, at this time, is enormous, larger than any human institution has ever been, stretching from the cold, misty shores of Britain in the north, all the way south to the sun-baked sands of North Africa. From the Atlantic coast in the west, eastward past the gleaming cities of Greece, past the busy ports of the Levant, all the way to the edge of the Persian desert. 40 to 50 million people, all living under one name, one law, one idea. Imagine standing at the center of it, in the Forum of Rome, just as the morning sun begins to climb above the rooftops. The air smells of bread baking in clay ovens, of smoke from 1,000 cooking fires, of flowers laid at the foot of a marble temple. Pigeons wheel overhead, white against the pale blue sky. Merchants are setting up their stalls, calling out in a dozen languages: Latin, Greek, Aramaic, the clicking consonants of Egyptian traders, the softer vowels of men come down from the mountains of Gaul. The city hums. It has always hummed like this, for as long as anyone alive can remember. Aqueducts carry clean water from the hills into 100 public fountains. The roads run straight and true in every direction, paved with great flat stones worn smooth by centuries of sandal feet and iron-rimmed wheels. A letter posted in Rome could reach the coast of Spain in 2 weeks, could reach Alexandria in a month. The machine works. And yet, even in the hum, there are dissonances, small things a careful listener might notice. The man standing beside the temple of Jupiter, the one in the soldier's cloak, with tired eyes, he has served 4 emperors in the last 12 years. 4, each one proclaimed by his own army, in some far corner of the empire, each one dead before his time. This is the crisis of the 3rd century, though no one has named it that yet. No one has had the distance to name it. They are living inside it, the way you live inside a season, feeling the cold creeping in, but not yet knowing how long the winter will be. Between the years 235 and 284, Rome will see more than 50 men claim the title of emperor. Some will reign for years, some for months. One, it is said, for just a few hours. But we are not going to rush toward those turbulent decades tonight. Tonight, we are simply going to settle into this world, to feel its textures, its temperatures, its rhythms. So let your breathing slow, just a little more, and imagine now that you are not in the city itself, but on the road outside it, the Via Appia, the great Appian Way stretching southward from Rome's gates. It is early morning. The light is still young and golden, slanting sideways through the umbrella pines that line the road. Their shadows lie long across the pale stone. A cart horse clops along slowly, pulling its load of amphory clay jars filled with olive oil from somewhere in the south. You are walking. There is no hurry. On either side of you, the road is lined with tombs. Romans buried their dead outside the city walls, along the roads, so that travelers would always pass among the remembered. Stone markers, little carved portraits, names worn soft by weather. Here lies Gaius, beloved husband, gone too soon. For Livia, who laughed easily and loved well. Marcus Aurelius Secundus, veteran of the Danube campaign. So many names, so many small lives, folded into the great life of the empire. The cart horse reaches a milestone, a round stone pillar carved with numbers of distance to the next town, and beyond that, the distance back to Rome. All roads, the Romans said, lead back to Rome. And from this milestone, all the numbers count outward from the golden milestone at the center of the forum, the umbilicus urbis, the navel of the city, the still point of a turning world. There is something comforting in that image, isn't there? A center, a point from which everything radiates, and to which everything can return. Let that image stay with you for a moment. A golden center, and long roads reaching outward in every direction, through forests and over mountains and across wide rivers, all connected, all part of one vast, breathing thing. That is Rome. That is what Rome felt like, from the inside to the people who lived in it. Not fragile, not ending, permanent, the way the hills are permanent, the way the river is permanent. They could not have known the man with tired soldier's eyes, the merchant calling out in Aramaic, the woman laying flowers at the temple. They could not have known that the world they were standing in was a high-water mark, that slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly, the tide had already begun to turn. We left Rome in the early morning light, on the Appian Way, with the sound of a cart horse fading into the distance. Now let us go a little further into the century. The year is 235 A.D., and something has changed in the air. There is a man on horseback, riding hard along a road in the province of Germania, the frontier territory where Rome's empire met the wild, forested lands beyond. His name is Maximinus Thrax. He is enormous. The ancient sources say he stood nearly 8 feet tall, though we can gently forgive them their exaggerations. He was, by all accounts, a giant of a man, a soldier's soldier, the son of a Thracian farmer who had worked his way up through the ranks of the Roman army by sheer physical force and relentless will. He has just done something that had never quite been done before, not in this way, not so openly. His soldiers have declared him emperor, not the Senate in Rome, not some careful political succession. His soldiers, out here on the muddy frontier, cold and tired and wanting a leader they could believe in, they raised their swords and named him. And so it began. Let that image settle for a moment. A giant of a man on a dark horse, riding toward Rome, wearing an emperor's purple he had never asked for and could not quite believe was his. There is something almost dreamlike about it. Before Maximinus, the emperors of Rome had been, by and large, politicians, men of the Senate, men of wealthy families, men who had navigated the complicated social architecture of Roman power, who knew the right people, spoke the right Greek, read the right philosophy. Maximinus could barely read at all. He spoke Latin with a heavy accent. He had never set foot in the Senate chamber. He had spent his entire life in military camps on the Danube, on the Rhine, in the deserts of the East, learning the only language he truly trusted, which was a language of soldiers. And now he was the most powerful man in the world. He would reign for 3 years. Then his own soldiers, tired of him, would kill him in his tent. This would become the pattern. For nearly 50 years, from 235 to 284 A.D., the Roman Empire will be ruled by a rapid, dizzying succession of soldier emperors. Men lifted up by their legions, ruling for a season or a year or sometimes just a few desperate months, then brought down again by rivals, by assassins, by the very soldiers who had raised them. Historians would later call it the crisis of the 3rd century. It wasn't one crisis. Exactly. It was many crises braided together, the armies pulling in different directions, the borders under pressure from outside Gothic tribes pushing in from the north, the newly resurgent Persian Empire pressing from the east, plague moving through the cities, the old trade routes disrupted, the currency slowly losing its value as emperors melted down silver coins to mint new ones, thinner and thinner, to pay for endless wars. The great machine was still running, but you could hear the grinding if you listened. Breathe out slowly, and imagine now that you are somewhere quieter, not on the frontier, with its noise and cold and urgency, but in a small town in the interior of the empire in northern Italy, perhaps, or southern Gaul, the kind of place where the crisis of the 3rd century arrives mostly as rumor, as a name heard in the marketplace, as a slightly heavier tax, a slightly shorter supply of certain goods. Life here is not dramatic. It is a town of perhaps 3,000 people. There is a forum smaller than Rome's, but well kept, with a temple at one end and a basilica, a large covered hall used for public business at the other. There is a bathhouse, fed by a modest aqueduct. There are potters and weavers and farmers, and a school where a tired man teaches the children of the wealthy their Latin grammar. The mosaics on the floors of the finer houses are beautiful. Geometric patterns in red and black and cream. A hunting scene in the corridor of the magistrate's home, horses and dogs and a day, frozen in the moment just before the chase ends. Life goes on. It nearly always does, even in the midst of great historical turbulence. The bread is baked. The wine is pressed. The children are born and named and grow up speaking the language of Rome as naturally as breathing. But here and there, you notice the cracks. The road through town, it used to be repaired every few years. A crew sent from provincial capital with fresh gravel and new curbing stones. It has not been repaired in a decade now. The ruts are deep. A section near the old gate has simply been left to crumble. The garrison that used to be stationed here, a small unit of soldiers, mostly keeping the peace, dealing with bandits on the hill roads that were reassigned 2 years ago, called to the frontier. No one has come to replace them. The magistrate writes letters to the provincial capital asking for funds, for soldiers, for attention. The replies, when they come at all, are polite and vague. Let your body soften a little more. Feel your shoulders release. This is a textured decline, not thunder and catastrophe, but small things, deferred repairs, unanswered letters. The slow withdrawal of attention from the edges to the center, as the center struggles to hold itself together. Back in Rome itself, in the marble corridors of the Palatine Hill where the emperors had their palace, the mood was complicated. The Senate still met. The ceremonies still happened, the great procession through the forum, the sacrifices of the temples, the long formal speeches in which men spoke of Rome's eternal power and her divine destiny with every evidence of sincerity. But in private, the senators who had served through 4 or 5 emperors in a decade knew something that the ceremonies were designed to obscure. The center was fragile. It had been fragile for a long time, longer than most would admit. But now the fragility was visible if you knew how to look. There was a man, we don't know his name, so let us simply call him the old senator who had served Rome for 40 years by the time the crisis was in full swing. He had seen emperors come and go since he was a young man. He had learned to arrange his face into an expression of serene confidence during the official ceremonies, and to say nothing during the private dinners afterward that might be repeated to the wrong people. He was very good at his job. At night, in his study, by the light of an oil lamp that made the shadows dance on the shelves of his books, he read. Philosophy, mostly. Stoic philosophy, the Roman tradition that counseled acceptance of what cannot be changed, attention to what is within one's own power, equanimity in the face of a disordered world. You cannot control the emperor, the philosophy said. You cannot control the barbarians at the border, or the plague in the streets, or the value of the coin in your purse. You can control only your own response to these things, your own mind, your own small patch of the world. He found this comforting. Most nights, let yourself drift toward that image, the old senator's study, warm and lamplit, the smell of old papyrus and olive oil, the quiet scratch of a stylus and wax. Outside the window, Rome murmurs in the dark, 10 miles of it in every direction. The greatest city in the world, still breathing, still dreaming, still believing in itself with a kind of magnificent stubbornness that is, in its own way, heroic. The crisis of the 3rd century would eventually end, not with a bang, but with a man or soldier, as so many of them were, who was clever enough and ruthless enough and, crucially, fortunate enough to survive long enough to actually fix things. His name was Diocletian. But that is the story of the next part of the night. For now, let the lamplight fade, let the old senator set down his book, let Rome settle into its nighttime quiet, the dogs barking somewhere in the distance, the stars very bright above the 7 hills. And let yourself go a little deeper, into the soft, dark, dreamless place that is waiting for you. The year is 284 A.D., the crisis of the 3rd century, that long, chaotic half-century of soldier emperors and civil wars and crumbling roads and unanswered letters, is drawing to a close. And it is ending, as Rome's great chapters so often did, with a single man. His name is Diocles. He will later be known to history as Diocletian. He is a soldier, as nearly all the emperors of this era were born in the province of Dalmatia, on the eastern shore of the Adriatic Sea, in a small town that no longer exists. His father may have been a slave who earned his freedom, or a scribe. The records are uncertain, and Diocletian himself never much cared to discuss his origins. What mattered was where he had arrived. Imagine him now, standing on a hill above the Bosphorus, the narrow strait where Europe and Asia nearly touch, where the water is always moving, always catching the light in a different way. He is 50 years old, perhaps, a compact, weathered man, with a kind of stillness that comes not from peace but from absolute self-mastery. Decades of military campaigns, decades of watching other men make mistakes, reaching too fast, trusting too easily, losing their heads in moments that call for patience. He has not made those mistakes. He is still alive, in the Rome of the 3rd century. That alone was a remarkable achievement. And now his soldiers have raised him up, as so many soldiers had raised so many men before him. But Diocletian is different from Maximinus, different from the others. He is not simply a fighter. He is a thinker, a planner. He looks out at the empire vast, fraying, exhausted, and he does not despair. He makes a plan. Let your eyes stay closed. Let your breathing find its own slow rhythm. And think for a moment about what it would mean to inherit something enormous and broken, and to sit down quietly and ask yourself, what would actually fix this? Not what is glorious, not what is dramatic, what would actually work? Diocletian's answer was, in its way, radical. The empire was too large for one man to govern. This was simply true. It had been true for a long time, and the chaos of the past 50 years had proved it beyond any reasonable argument. The frontiers were too long, the threats too numerous. A crisis on the Rhine could not wait for news to travel to a palace on the Tiber and orders to travel back again. By then, everything would already be lost. So Diocletian did something that would have been unthinkable a century before. He divided power, not permanently, not as a fracture, but as a deliberate structure. 2 senior emperors, called Augusti, and 2 junior emperors in waiting, called Caesars, 4 rulers, governing 4 regions, each responsible for their own frontier, their own armies, their own crises. He called it the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. Picture it as a map, spread out across a wide table in a lamplit room. In the west, Diocletian's co-emperor Maximian holds a Rhine and the North African coast. In the east, Diocletian himself watches a Persian border. And at each corner, a junior sees a younger man, chosen carefully, being trained to one day step into the senior role. 4 hands on the wheel, 4 sets of eyes watching the horizon. It was, in its way, an elegant solution. For a while, for surprisingly long while it worked. Diocletian also reformed the army, restructured it, created a mobile reserve force that could be sent rapidly to wherever it was needed, rather than having every soldier fixed permanently to a single stretch of wall. He reformed the tax system, which had become a tangle of exemptions and corruptions and local variations that made it nearly impossible to know how much money the empire actually had. He issued a famous edict on maximum prices in an attempt to control the rampant inflation that had been eating away at ordinary Roman saving for decades. The edict on prices would ultimately fail. Markets are stubborn things. But the impulse behind the desire to bring order to chaos, to name the problem clearly and attempt a solution, that impulse was characteristic of the man. He was a builder, a fixer, a man who believed, with a deep conviction of someone who had survived where others had not, that diligence and method and clear thinking could hold the world together. Let that thought drift through you like something warm. The idea that patience and careful attention can hold things together, that the slow, unglamorous work of maintenance, of tending to what exists, of repairing rather than abandoning, has its own kind of heroism. Diocletian ruled for 21 years. 21 years longer than any emperor since the great Marcus Aurelius, a century before. Long enough to actually change things. Long enough to let the reforms take hold. To let the new systems become habits, to let the empire breathe again. And then, and this is a part of the story that history has never quite recovered from its astonishment at, he retired. He simply stopped in 305 AD at a ceremony in the city of Nicomedia before his assembled court and soldiers and co-emperors. Diocletian removed the purple robe of imperial power and handed it to his Caesar, the man who would succeed him. And then he went home to Dalmatia, the province where he had been born, to a vast palace he had been quietly building for himself on the Adriatic coast, what is now the city of Split in modern Croatia. A palace that was part imperial residence, part fortress, part retirement home. Its thick stone walls, its colonnaded walkways, its rooms opening onto the sound of the sea. He grew cabbages. This is not a metaphor. He genuinely grew cabbages in a garden inside the palace walls. When his former colleagues, mired in the political chaos that followed his retirement, begged him to come back to resume power, to restore order, he reportedly replied that if they could see the cabbages he had grown, they would not ask him to give up such happiness for the storms of power. There is something in that image that asked to be held for a moment. A man who held the world in his hands and chose cabbages. The Adriatic when moving through the garden. The sound of the sea just beyond the walls. The smell of turned earth and growing things. After 20 years of armies and edicts and crises and the exhausting, relentless weight of absolute power. Just a garden. Just the quiet. Let your own body be that quiet now. Feel the weight of your limbs against whatever is beneath you. Let the tension in your jaw soften, in your hands, your feet. You don't have to hold anything together right now. Diocletian died in 311 or 312, the records are uncertain, in his palace by the sea. He was in his late 60s, which was a considerable age for a man of his era, and especially for a soldier emperor. He had outlived his own system. The tetrarchy, the elegant rule of 4, had already begun to collapse without him. The men he had chosen, and the men after them, could not hold the arrangement together. Old habits of ambition reasserted themselves. Each Augustus wanted to be the only Augustus. Each Caesar wanted to be emperor. By the time Diocletian died in his garden, civil war had broken out again, and out of that civil war, one man would emerge, a man who would change not just the empire, but the entire history of Western civilization. His name was Constantine, but that is a story that belongs to the next quiet stretch of the night. His name was Constantine. He was the son of one of Diocletian's co-emperors, a man named Constantius, who had ruled the western provinces and died of illness in the city of York, in the cold north of Britain, in the year 306. His soldiers, loyal to the family name, immediately declared Constantine his father's successor. It was the old pattern, again, the soldiers raising their man, the purple thrust upon someone standing in a muddy provincial camp far from Rome. But Constantine was not Maximinus Thrax, that giant of the frontier who could barely read and barely last. Constantine was educated, politically shrewd, and possessed of something rarer still in the Rome of his era, a sense of destiny. Let that word settle for a moment. Destiny. It is a word that means different things in different mouths. In some mouths it is grandiose, a little hollow. But in Constantine's case, it seems to have been something genuine, a deep, unshakable conviction that he was meant for something, that history had its eye on him, that the forces shaping the world had chosen him as their instrument. Whether he was right is perhaps less important than the fact that he believed it, and that belief made him formidable. For 6 years, Constantine fought his way towards sole power, across the Alps, down through Italy, defeating rival after rival not just by force, but by strategy, by timing, by the kind of cold patience that wins wars of attrition. By 312 AD, only one major rival stood between him and control of the entire Western Empire. His name was Maxentius, and he controlled Rome itself, the city, the grain supply, the symbolic heart of everything. The two armies met just north of Rome, at a place called the Milvian Bridge, where a stone crossing spanned the river Tiber. And here the story takes a turn that no historian has ever quite been able to account for with complete tidiness. The night before the battle, Constantine had a vision, or a dream, or a sign in the sky. The accounts differ, and Constantine himself told the story differently at different times in his life, which is the sort of thing that happens when a story becomes too important to be left in just one version. But the core of it is this: he saw, or dreamed, a symbol. The first two letters of the Greek word for Christ, Chi, and Rho, overlaid on each other, forming a shape something like a P with an X through its stem. And with it came words, in some versions of the story, that he later translated into Latin. In this sign, conquer, he ordered his soldiers to paint the symbol on their shields. And the next morning, they crossed the Milvian Bridge and won. Breathe out slowly. There is something about that moment, an army crossing a river in the early morning, shields marked with a symbol they barely understood, a man at their head who had dreamed of victory and convinced himself, and then them, that the dream was real. There is something very human in it. The way belief can become its own kind of force. The way a story told with enough conviction can change the world it describes. Constantine won the battle. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber. His army routed. Rome opened its gates. And the following year, in 313 AD, Constantine and his Eastern co-emperor issued a document that would echo through the next 2,000 years of Western history. The Edict of Milan. It was not technically a proclamation of Christianity as a state religion that would come later. It was something subtler and in some ways more remarkable, a declaration of religious tolerance. All religions in the empire were to be free to practice without persecution. Property seized from Christians during the great persecutions of the previous century was to be returned. It was, by the standards of the ancient world, an extraordinary act of restraint. And it set Christianity, still a minority faith, still largely associated in Roman minds with the poor and the enslaved and the stubborn, onto a path that would carry it to the center of Western civilization. Let yourself drift with that image for a moment. A single document, written in a lamplit room in a city in northern Italy, rippling outward across centuries, shaping the churches and cathedrals and monasteries that would one day preserve the fragments of Roman learning through the long medieval dark, shaping the languages and laws and moral frameworks of nations that did not yet exist. History is full of these moments. Decisions made by tired men in small rooms that turned out to matter enormously in ways no one in the room could have foreseen. Constantine ruled for another 24 years after the Milvian Bridge. He was, by any measure, one of the most consequential emperors Rome ever produced. He founded a new city, on the shore of the Bosphorus, that narrow strait between Europe and Asia, where we imagine Diocletian standing, looking out at the water. Constantine built a new capital. He called it, with characteristic modesty, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. It was designed from the beginning to be a second Rome. 7 hills, like Rome, a forum, like Rome, a senate, like Rome, but newer, cleaner, better positioned at the crossroads of the eastern trade routes, commanding the sea lanes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Constantinople would endure for over 1,000 years after the Western Empire fell. It would be the capital of what we now call the Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of Rome, which simply kept going and going and going while the West gradually came apart. But that is getting ahead of ourselves. For now, it is evening in Constantinople. The city is still being built, scaffolding on the great columns, dust in the air from 1,000 construction sites, the smell of fresh-cut marble and new mortar. Constantine stands on a balcony overlooking the Bosphorus. The water below is dark and silver and always moving. On the far shore, Asia begins the ancient, complicated East, with its spices and its silks and its own long histories that make Rome seem almost young. He is an old man now. Not by our standards, he is perhaps in his early 60s, but by the standards of a life lived in military campaigns and political crisis and the unrelenting pressure of absolute power, he is tired. He has not yet been baptized as a Christian. He will wait until he is on his deathbed to take that final step of common enough practice in an era when baptism was believed to wash away all sins, and a man who still had wars to fight and enemies to deal with could find that timing convenient. But he believes, in his way, in the God who showed him the sign before the Milvian Bridge, in the destiny that has carried him this far. He will die in 337 A.D. in a villa outside the city in the spring, and with his death, the old problem returns almost immediately. His sons, 3 of them, divide the empire between them, and then, with a speed that would be almost farcical if it were not so bloody, begin killing each other. Within a few years, only one son remains, and the sons after him will struggle too, and the emperors after them, each one inheriting a world slightly more frayed than the one before. Each one doing their best, or failing to, with what they have been given. But tonight is not about the struggling. Tonight, let the image be this one. Constantine on his balcony, above the Bosphorus, in the evening. The new city glowing softly behind him, its torches and oil lamps coming on one by one as the sky darkens, 1,000 small flames scattered across the hills, like stars coming down to earth. Like a candle held up against a very great dark. We have traveled quite a distance through the centuries now, from the golden morning on the Appian Way, through the chaos of the soldier emperors, through Diocletian in his garden and Constantine and his candle above the Bosphorus. We are in the late 4th century now, around 370 A.D. The empire is still standing, still enormous, still impressive on any map you care to draw. But something is moving out beyond the edges of that map, something that Rome did not cause and could not stop and perhaps could not even fully see until it was already upon them. Far to the east, further east than most Romans ever thought about, further than the Persian border, further than the Silk Roads that brought luxury goods from China through a dozen intermediary hands. There's a people moving. They are called the Huns. Where they came from exactly is a question historians still argue about. The steppes of Central Asia, almost certainly those vast, flat, wind-scoured grasslands that stretch from Hungary all the way to Mongolia, a sea of grass so large that it has its own weather, its own seasons, its own logic that is nothing like the logic of the Mediterranean world. The Huns were nomads. They lived on horseback not metaphorically, but literally. Ancient sources, wide-eyed with something between admiration and horror, claimed that Hun warriors could eat, sleep, negotiate, and conduct the business of daily life without ever dismounting. Their horses were short and shaggy and enormously tough. Their riders were short too, stocky and bow-legged from a lifetime in the saddle, and they were among the finest mounted archers the ancient world had ever seen. No one knows exactly what set them moving westward. Climate change, perhaps a drying of the eastern steppes that pushed the grasslands back and made the old grazing grounds insufficient. Pressure from other peoples further east. Simple opportunism, the ancient logic of migration. The land here is harder, the land that looks better, and we are people who know how to move. Whatever the reason, in the 370s the Huns began pushing west with a speed and ferocity that sent shockwaves through every people in their path. Let yourself imagine the steppe for a moment. Lie still and picture it. Flat, immense. The sky enormous overhead, more sky than land, the horizon a clean, unbroken line in every direction. The grass pale gold in the autumn, rippling in the wind like the surface of a shallow sea. The cold coming fast when the sun goes down, a deep, dry cold, not the damp cold of the Mediterranean winter, but something sharper, something that means business. And across this landscape, moving, a people, thousands of them, tens of thousands, their felt tents packed onto wagons, their herds of horses and cattle moving alongside, children and elderly riding in the carts, warriors on horseback ranging out ahead and to the sides, scouting, always watching the horizon. They travel light, they travel fast, and they do not stop. The first people to feel the full force of the Hunnic advance were the Alans and nomadic people of the western steppes, and then, more consequentially for Rome, the Goths. The Goths were not Romans, but by the late 4th century, they were not exactly strangers either. For generations, Gothic peoples had lived along the northern edges of the Roman frontier along the Danube, in the territories Rome called Gothia. They had traded with Rome, served in Roman armies. Some had converted to Christianity in a Gothic translation of the Bible made by a remarkable bishop named Wulfila, who invented a whole new alphabet just to write it down. Gothic commanders had risen to high rank in the Roman military. Gothic craftsmen made goods that found their way into Roman markets. The Goths and Rome had a relationship, complicated, wary, occasionally violent, but a relationship nonetheless. And then the Huns arrived behind them. Breathe out slowly. Feel the stillness of where you are, the safety of walls and warmth and a roof against the sky. And hold for just a moment the feeling of what it would mean to have nowhere left to stand. In 376 AD, a massive group of Visigoths, the western branch of the Gothic people, arrived at the Danube, the great river that had marked the northern boundary of Roman civilization for centuries. On the far side, the empire, safety, or at least something safer than what was coming up behind them. They sent emissaries across the river to the Roman Emperor Valens, who was governing the eastern half of the empire from Constantinople. Their message was simple and desperate. Let us in. We will serve you. We will fight for you. We will be your soldiers, your farmers, your settlers. We will fill the empty lands along the frontier that need filling. We will become, in whatever way you need us to become, Roman. Only let us in. because what is coming behind us is something we cannot face alone. Valens said yes. It was not an unreasonable decision. The empire had been absorbing barbarian people for centuries, settling them on Roman land, enrolling them in Roman armies, folding them gradually into the enormous, diverse fabric of Roman life. It had worked before. It could work again. The problem was not the decision. The problem was the execution. The Roman officials responsible for managing the Gothic crossing were corrupt, or overwhelmed, or both. The Goths were supposed to be disarmed before entering the empire's standard practice, reasonable precaution. It didn't happen, or happened incompletely. They were supposed to be fed and settled. The empire had agreed to provide grain and land. The grain didn't come, or came too slowly, in insufficient quantities. People were hungry. Children were hungry. Roman merchants, sensing opportunity, arrived at the Gothic camps to trade. The prices they charged were extortionate. The ancient sources say that some Goths, desperate to feed their families, sold their own children into slavery in exchange for dog meat. If that image is too sharp for the quiet of the night, let it soften. Let it become simply the knowledge that things went badly, that the welcome was not a welcome, that the Goths crossed the Danube as refugees and were treated as a problem. And problems, when they are hungry and armed and have nothing left to lose, have a way of finding their own solutions. In 377 A.D., the Visigoths rose up. They moved through the Balkans through the Roman province of Thrace, in what is now Bulgaria and northern Greece, raiding, burning, taking what they needed because no one was giving it to them. The Roman army tried to contain them, failed, tried again, and then came the battle that would send a shudder through the entire Roman world. 376 A.D. The city of Adrianople, in Thrace. The Emperor Valens himself had come to deal with the Gothic uprising. He had an army, a good army, by the standards of the time, and he had intelligence or thought he had suggesting that the Gothic force was smaller than it was, poorly positioned, ready to negotiate. Perhaps he decided not to wait for reinforcements that were already on their way. He attacked. The Gothic cavalry, heavier, faster, more numerous than his scouts had reported, swept around the flanks of the Roman lines before they could form properly. The battle lasted perhaps 2 hours. When it was over, the Emperor Valens was dead. 2/3 of his army was dead. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman military history. Rome had lost battles before. Rome had lost emperors before. But something about Adrianople felt different, permanent, like a door swinging open on a hinge that would never quite close again. Let your breathing slow now. The battle is over. The dust is settling on the plain outside Adrianople. The stars are coming out above Thrace, cold and clear and indifferent, the way stars have always been. History is not made of one moment. Not really. But sometimes one moment crystallizes something that was already becoming true, makes visible what was already quietly underway. Adrianople was that kind of moment. After Adrianople, the new emperor, a capable soldier named Theodosius, made peace with the Visigoths. He settled them inside the empire, allowed them to live under their own leaders, their own laws, as a kind of nation within a nation. Federated allies, the Romans called them. Foederati. It was pragmatic. It was perhaps the only realistic option. And it worked after a fashion, for a generation. But the shape of the world had changed. The people were inside the walls now, not absorbed, not dissolved into the fabric of Roman life, but present, intact, coherent, armed, proud, and watching. Waiting, though perhaps none of them quite knew yet what they were waiting for. The wind moves across the Danube tonight, that wide, dark river, moving steadily toward the sea the way it has always moved, caring nothing for the empires that have built their walls along its banks. On one side, The campfires of the foederati, small and orange in the dark. On the other side, the lights of Roman towns further apart now than they used to be, a little dimmer, but still burning, still holding, for a little while longer, still holding. We are in the year 408 AD. Nearly a century has passed since Constantine lit his candle above the Bosphorus. The empire he ruled has continued its slow transformation, more Christian now, more divided, more dependent on the federated peoples settled inside its borders to fill the ranks of its armies. In fact, the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire have been governed separately for over a decade now since the death of Theodosius in 395, who was the last man to rule both halves alone. His sons divided it between them, and the division, intended as administrative convenience, has quietly begun to feel permanent. The eastern half, Constantinople, Greece, Asia Minor, Egypt, the Levant is wealthy, stable, well-positioned. It will be fine for a very long time. It is the West we are watching tonight. In the West, the capital is no longer Rome. That might surprise you. It surprised many Romans too, in a vague, unsettled way that they rarely spoke about directly. But the practicalities of governing a frontier empire had long since pulled the emperors away from the city on the seven hills. They needed to be closer to the armies, closer to the borders, closer to wherever the latest crisis was unfolding. By 408, the Western Emperor governs from Ravenna, a small city on the Adriatic coast of northern Italy, surrounded by marshes that made it difficult to attack and easy to defend. Safe, comfortable, and very far from the center of things. The emperor in Ravenna in 408 is a young man named Honores. He is not a bad man. Exactly. He is simply insufficient. Timid where courage was needed. Indecisive where clarity was needed. The ancient sources remember him keeping chickens in the palace at Ravenna and being more distressed when Rome fell by the death of his favorite hen, also named Roma, than by the news of the city's fate. This may be unfair. History is not always kind to the people it catches on the wrong side of a hinge moment. But it is true that the real power in the Western Empire in these years was not Honores. It was his general. His name was Stilicho, and he is one of the more poignant figures in this whole long story. Stilicho was half Roman, half Vandal. His father had been one of the federated barbarian soldiers who had served Rome and risen through its ranks. He had married the niece of the Emperor Theodosius. He was, by any measure, a Roman in his education, his loyalties, his ambitions, his sense of duty to the empire he served. He was also, in the eyes of many Romans, irreducibly foreign, something to be used when needed and suspected always. A barbarian general holding Roman power, which made the senators in Rome profoundly, persistently uncomfortable, regardless of how faithfully he served. He served very faithfully. For over a decade, Stilicho was a military backbone of the Western Empire. He fought off invasions. He managed the complicated politics of the federated peoples. He held things together with the kind of unglamorous, relentless competence that history tends to notice only in hindsight. And then, in 408, his enemies at the court of Ravenna convinced the weak Emperor Honorius that Stilicho was a traitor, planning to hand power to his son, conspiring with the barbarians. The charges were almost certainly false. Honorius had him arrested, executed. Let that settle for a moment. The one man capable of holding the West together, destroyed by the fears and jealousies of the court he had spent his life protecting. There is a particular kind of sadness in that. Not dramatic, not operatic, just a quiet, terrible sadness of competence undone by fear. And waiting outside the walls, because there is always, in these years, someone waiting outside the walls, was a man named Alaric. Alaric was a Visigoth, a king of the Visigoths, or something close to it, a war leader, a man his people followed because he was formidable and because he had a quality that is very hard to define and very easy to recognize, which is a quality of someone who will not stop. He had served Rome. For years he had served Rome, fighting in Roman campaigns under Roman commanders, expecting the rewards that had been promised: a senior military appointment, land, recognition, the formal acknowledgement that he and his people were part of the empire they had been bleeding for. The rewards never came, or came late, or incompletely, or were rescinded before they could be enjoyed. Alaric had marched on Rome twice before 408 and been bought off each time. Gold, silver, silk, pepper, enormous quantities of treasure in exchange for withdrawing. The Senate, paying the ransoms, complained bitterly. One senator called it not peace but a pact of slavery. But they paid, and each time Alaric withdrew and waited, and the promises that were made to him afterward were not kept. In 408, with Stilicho dead and the court at Ravenna paralyzed by its own fears and factions, Alaric marched south again. This time he did not stop at the gates. He blockaded Rome, cut off its supplies, let hunger do what armies sometimes cannot. The city negotiated, paid again. He withdrew again. More negotiations, more broken promises from Ravenna, which could not or would not deliver what Alaric needed. He came back, and on the night of August 24th, in the year 410 A.D., Rome fell. Breathe out slowly. Those two words carry an enormous weight, don't they? Rome fell. And yet, and this is important, and worth holding on to as you rest, it did not fall the way you might imagine. There was no wall of fire, no tide of destruction rolling through marble streets, no single night of annihilation. The gates were opened possibly by slaves inside the city, possibly by sympathizers. The details are uncertain, and the Visigoths came in. They were there for 3 days. They looted. They took gold and silver and silk and the accumulated portable wealth of centuries. They were violent, in places, as armies always are. People suffered, and people fled, and the trauma was real. But the Visigoths were also, by 410, significantly Christianized. Alaric gave orders, whether followed or not is hard to know, that the Christian churches were to be respected, that those who took refuge in them were to be protected. Several of the great basilicas were left untouched. The Eternal City was not burned. Its great buildings still stood. The Colosseum, the Forum, the temples and baths and aqueducts still there. The morning after, what was shattered was something harder to see and harder to rebuild than stone. It was the idea that Rome could not fall. It sounds almost simple when you say it plainly, but try to imagine what it meant for people who had grown up breathing that assumption, whose grandparents and great-grandparents had breathed it, for whom the permanence of Rome was not a political opinion, but something closer to a law of nature, as obvious and reliable as the rising of the sun. To have that assumption broken. Saint Jerome, one of the great Christian scholars of the age, was living in Bethlehem when the news arrived. He wrote that when he heard it, he fell silent, could not speak, could not write, could not think in any ordered way. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. He wrote, "Let those words drift past like clouds." The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. Alaric did not stay in Rome. He moved south, through Italy, toward the toe of the boot, perhaps intending to cross into North Africa and the grain supply that fed the Western Empire. He never made it. In late 410, still in southern Italy, Alaric fell ill, quickly, unexpectedly, and died. His people buried him in the bed of a river, the Busento, in Calabria, diverting the water, laying him to rest with his treasures in the riverbed, then releasing the water back over him and killing the slaves who had done the work, so that the location would never be known. He lies there still, somewhere beneath that river, the man who sacked Rome, alone in the dark water. The river moves over him tonight, as it has moved for 1,600 years, cool and dark and unhurried, carrying its secret quietly toward the sea. After the sack of Rome, life went on. This is perhaps the most remarkable thing about the decades that followed 410. Not the drama, there was drama. There was always drama, but the extraordinary, stubborn ordinariness of daily life continuing inside the slow unwinding of an empire. People woke up, made bread, argued with their neighbors about the property line, fell in love, had children, planted things in the ground and waited for them to grow. The world was changing, and the world was also, somehow, still the world. Let us go somewhere quiet tonight, not to the courts and the councils and the crumbling frontier. We have been there enough. Tonight let us find a house, a modest house, in a modest town, somewhere in the south of Gaul, what we would now call France, though it did not have that name yet, and would not for some time. The town sits in a river valley because towns in Gaul almost always sit in river valleys, where the land is flat and the water reliable and the soil deep and dark and generous. There are vineyards on the slopes above the town. There have been vineyards on those slopes for as long as anyone can remember. The Romans planted them generations back, and the roots go very deep now, deep enough that no one thinks of them as Roman anymore. They are simply there, part of the land. Part of what the land is. The house belongs to a family of moderate means. Not wealthy, not poor. The father works land he half owns and half rents from a larger estate nearby. The mother keeps the house, tends a kitchen garden, and is quietly the more capable of the two, in the way that the more capable person in a partnership often goes unrecorded by history. There are 3 children. The oldest is a boy of perhaps 12, serious face, already helping with the harvest. The middle child is a girl who spends too much time, in her mother's opinion, sitting by the river and looking at things, birds, water, clouds, the way light changes on the surface of the current. The youngest is a baby who does what babies do, which is exist with great intensity and sleep at inconvenient hours. On the wall of the main room, there is a small cross. This family is Christian, as nearly everyone in the empire is by now. The old god Jupiter and Juno and Mars and all the rest are still remembered, in the way that old things are remembered, in certain sayings, in the names of days and months, in habits of mind that persist long after their original meaning has been forgotten. But the cross is on the wall, and there is a small church at the edge of town where the family goes on Sundays to hear a priest speak in Latin, a slightly different Latin than they use at home, more formal, older sounding, the Latin of Scripture. Let your body be as still as a house at night, when the fire is burned down to embers, and the children are asleep in their corner, and the dog has settled on the threshold, and the only sound is the breathing of everyone you love, slow and steady in the dark. This town has heard about the sack of Rome. The news arrived weeks after it happened, traveling the old road network that was still functioning, if not quite so smoothly as it once had. It came as rumor first, disbelieved, then as confirmation that could not be argued with. People were shocked, then frightened, then gradually, over the following weeks and months, something like resigned. Rome had fallen and the world had not ended. The sun still rose. The vine still needed tending. The baby was teething and did not care about Rome at all. A generation later, the children of these children would barely think about it. This is a texture of the 5th century in the West. Not apocalypse, not sudden darkness, but a long, slow, uneven fading like the light in a room when someone turns a lamp down gradually, so gradually that you keep thinking the light is fine. It is fine, right up until the moment you realize you cannot quite make out the words on the page anymore. The roads were maintained less often. Some fell into disrepair and were simply abandoned. The traffic that had once used them finding other ways, smaller paths through the fields. The great public baths in the cities, those extraordinary social institutions that had been the heartbeat of Roman urban life, where people of all classes came to wash and gossip and do business, and simply together began to close, one by one. Too expensive to heat, too expensive to staff, the pipes crumbling, the aqueducts losing water. The cities themselves grew smaller. Not all of them, not all at once. But the trend across the 5th century in the West was inward, people moving to the countryside, the great urban populations contracting, the civic architecture, the forums and basilicas and temples standing increasingly empty or converted to other purposes, or slowly dismantled for building materials. But here is what did not disappear. The Latin language. It was changing, fracturing, really, into the regional dialects that would one day become French and Spanish and Italian and Portuguese and Romanian. But it was everywhere, in the church, in the law courts, in the markets, in the mouths of people who would have been astonished to be called Romans, but who thought in a language Rome had given them. The law. Roman legal thought, the long tradition of jurisprudence, of written codes, of rights and procedures, and the idea that power should be accountable to stated rules that survive, was preserved in the church, was adapted by the new kingdoms that were forming in the old Roman territories. The memory, the idea of Rome, its greatness, its order, its civilizing mission became, in its absence, more powerful than it had ever been in its presence. Every king who rose in the ruins of the Western Empire wanted to be Roman, wanted the title, the prestige, the legitimacy. The barbarian kingdoms that replaced the empire did not reject Rome. They wrapped themselves in it. Back in the river valley, the girl who likes to sit by the water is there again this evening. The harvest is in. There is a particular quality to the light in the south of Gaul in the early autumn, warm and golden and low, the shadows long, the air smelling of turned earth and grape must and wood smoke from the first fires of the season. She is watching a leaf on the surface of the river. It came from one of the trees on the far bank. You can see where it fell, see the small ripple it made landing, and now it is moving, turning slowly in the current, carried without effort in a direction it did not choose but does not resist. She watches it until it passes around the bend and out of sight. Then she watches the water where it was, then the water further on. She does not know that she is living in the twilight of the Western Roman Empire. She knows the name Rome. She knows the church in the town, and the Latin the priest speaks, and the road that leads north toward the bigger town where there's a market on Thursdays. She knows the river, and the vineyards, and the feel of the soil in her hands when she helps her mother with the kitchen garden. She knows this valley, the way the light falls in it, the way the river sounds at different times of year. This is her world, and it is, in its way, enough. Let that be enough for you tonight, too. Not the whole world, not the whole of history. Just this, the room around you, the warmth of wherever you are lying, the soft dart pressing gently on your closed eyes, the sound of your own breathing, slow and easy. That is the whole world right now. That is everything. The river in the valley runs on through the night. The vines on the hillside are dark and still, their deep roots holding quietly in the earth. The family in the house is sleeping. The dog on the threshold is dreaming, his paws moving slightly, chasing something in a landscape that exists only in his sleeping mind. And the empire is fading. Quietly, gently, the way all things fade. Not with thunder, not with fire, but like a light turned slowly down, like a voice growing softer at the end of a long day, like breath evening out, slowing, deepening, until there's only the dark and the river and the stars above the valley that have been there since long before Rome and will be there long after. The year is 475 A.D. The Western Roman Empire is very small now. If you were to draw it on a map, and we will only do this briefly, only for a moment, Before we put the map away and return to the dock, it would be a thin strip of territory, essentially Italy, and not all of Italy. The great provinces that had made Rome wealthy and powerful for centuries are gone. Britain, abandoned decades ago. Gaul, divided among Frankish and Visigothic kingdoms. Spain, similarly divided. North Africa, taken by the Vandals. The Balkans, another story entirely. What remains is a small, tired thing wearing a very large name. The emperor of this small, tired thing is a man named Romulus. He is, by most accounts, a boy, a teenager. His father, a general named Orestes, who held the real power, had placed him on the throne the year before, hoping that the imperial purple on such young shoulders might buy the court some time, some legitimacy, some room to maneuver in the complicated politics of an empire running out of options. His full name, in one of those coincidences that history occasionally produces with what feels like deliberate irony, was Romulus Augustulus. Romulus, the name of the legendary founder of Rome, the boy raised by wolves who drew the first line in the soil and said, "Here's where the city will be." Augustulus, a diminutive of Augustus, the title of the first true emperor, the name that had meant power and majesty for 5 centuries. Little Augustus, little Romulus, the last emperor of the West, and he was a child, and his name contained the whole arc of Rome in miniature, beginning and end held together in 2 soft words. Let that image be very gentle in your mind. A boy on a throne too large for him, in a palace in Ravenna, surrounded by marshes, far from the city his name was built from. Not a villain, not a hero, just a boy, at the end of something enormous, doing what boys do, waiting to be told what happens next. What happened next was this. There was a general. His name was Odoacer, another federated commander, another man of barbarian origin who had risen through the ranks of the Roman military and found himself, in the chaos of the late 5th century, holding more real power than the emperor he technically served. Odoacer wanted recognition. He wanted the formal title of king over Italy, not emperor, not a challenge to the Eastern Empire in Constantinople, simply an acknowledgement of what was already true. That he ran things, that the fiction of a Western Roman emperor was no longer useful to anyone. In 476, he moved on Ravenna. Orestes, the boy emperor's father and the real power behind the throne, was captured and executed. And then Odoacer went to see the boy. Romulus Augustulus sat before him. Whatever Odoacer expected, defiance, perhaps, or tears, or some last proud gesture in the Roman tradition, what he found was a child, a frightened child in imperial robes, who was clearly no threat to anyone. Odoacer did something unexpected. He spared him. He sent Romulus into exile to a comfortable villa on the coast of Campania, in southern Italy, overlooking the Bay of Naples. He even granted him a pension, a modest allowance, enough to live on. And Romulus went. He walked away from the throne of the Western Roman Empire, this child with the ancient name, and went south to the warm coast, to a villa by the sea. And that was that. No battle, no burning, no final stand on the walls of a besieged city. Just a boy walking away. Just a general writing a letter to the emperor in Constantinople informing him that the Western Empire no longer required a separate emperor, that the one in the East was sufficient, that the regalia of the Western throne was being respectfully returned. The Eastern emperor, Zeno, received the letter, acknowledged it with diplomatic vagueness, made Odoacer a nominal official of the Eastern court, and the Western Roman Empire, the empire of Augustus and Trajan and Marcus Aurelius, of Diocletian, Constantine, of the Appian Way and the Colosseum and the aqueducts and the legions simply stopped, not with thunder, not with fire, with a letter, with a boy walking south toward the sea. Let that be the sound of it. Footsteps on a road, fading, the sea getting closer with each step, though you can't hear it yet. Won't hear it until the road crests the last hill, and there it is, the Bay of Naples spread out below, blue and enormous and indifferent and beautiful. The island sitting in it like dark stones, Vesuvius on the left with its old crown of smoke. The boy stops at the top of the hill. He looks back, once, at the road he came from. Then he looks at the sea. He will live in that villa for years. We do not know how long the records thin out. The way records do when a person is no longer historically important. He simply disappears into the ordinary life of a young man in early medieval Italy. Perhaps he swam in the bay. Perhaps he read, he had been educated, as Roman boys of his class were, in rhetoric and philosophy and the long literature of a civilization that had shaped him. Perhaps he sat in the evenings on a terrace above the water, and watched the sun go down behind Ischia, and felt something he did not have words for. Perhaps he barely thought about Rome at all. Perhaps, being young, he was simply glad to be alive. The water of the bay is very still tonight, the color of dark glass, the stars reflected in it, each one doubled one above, one below, so that the sky and the sea become the same thing, and there is no edge between them, no place where one ends and the other begins. Just light and dark, and the slow breathing of the water, in and out. The Eastern Empire carries on. In Constantinople, the great city above the Bosphorus, life continues much as it has. The Emperor Zeno sits on his throne. The markets are open. The churches are full. The scholars in their studies are copying manuscripts, old manuscripts, Roman manuscripts, Greek manuscripts, preserving in careful ink on careful parchment the words that would otherwise be lost. The empire of the East will last another 1,000 years. 1,000 years. Long enough that when it finally ends in 1453, when Ottoman cannons breach the walls of Constantinople, there will be people alive who have never known a world without it, whose grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents lived and died inside its borders, speaking Greek, calling themselves Romans, burning lamps before icons in churches decorated with gold that catches a light and holds it. But that is a very long way from tonight. Tonight is 476. Tonight is a boy on a hill above the Bay of Naples, looking at the sea. Tonight is an ending so quiet it barely made a sound. Let the quiet be enormous now. Let it fill the room around you. Let it fill the space behind your closed eyes. All the noise of the world, all the noise of your own thoughts, fading, the way an empire fades, not all at once, but gradually, peacefully, one lamp going out, and then another, until there is only the sea, and the stars above it, and the stars below it, and the soft, dark, limitless silence between. Rome is gone, and Rome is everywhere. The word September comes from the Latin septem, meaning 7, because in the old Roman calendar, September was the 7th month, before January and February were added, and everything shifted, and the numbers stopped making sense, but the names remained, as names do, long after the things they were attached to have changed beyond recognition. October, November, December, the 8th month, the 9th, the 10th, still counting, in a language no one speaks anymore. Every time you say what month it is, the days of the week, Saturday, Saturn's day, the old Roman god of harvest and time, still there, in the mouth of every person who has ever made plans for the weekend, not knowing they are invoking something ancient, something that watched the legions march and the aqueducts flow and the forum fill with the voices of the dead. Let those words move through you slowly. September, October, Saturday, old sounds, older than any living language, worn smooth by 2,000 years of mouths, like stones in a river bed, like the Appian Way beneath your feet on a quiet morning, warm but still there. The roads, So many of the roads of Europe still follow, at their root, the roots the Romans laid down. The engineers who built them understood something simple and permanent, that the straightest path between 2 points is the straightest path between 2 points, and the land does not change its shape very quickly, and what is efficient tends to endure. Beneath the motorways and the railway lines, beneath the medieval tracks that became modern streets, the ghost of the Roman road is still there, still pointing, still connecting one place to another across the body of continent. The law, the legal systems of France, of Spain, of Italy, of Romania, of every country that calls its law tradition Roman or civil, trace their roots back through the centuries to the Roman jurists who first wrote down the idea that law should be written, consistent, accessible, that power should be accountable to stated rules, that even an emperor was not above the law he had sworn to uphold. This idea did not always survive in practice, but it survived as an idea. And ideas, held long enough, eventually become practice again. The church, the Christian church that grew inside the Roman Empire, that absorbed its administrative structures and its Latin language and its tradition of centralized authority, that sent its missionaries along Roman roads to Roman provinces, that preserved in its monasteries a manuscript of Roman writers and Greek philosophers through the long medieval centuries, carries Rome inside it still. The Mass, for centuries, spoken in Latin. The architecture of the great cathedrals reaching back through Romanesque and Byzantine to the Roman basilica, that long hall with its high roof and its rows of columns and its sense of space organized for human gathering. Rome in stone, Rome in ritual, Rome in the structure of an institution that has now outlasted the empire by longer than the empire itself lasted. Let your breathing be very slow now. So slow, in and out, each breath a little longer than the last. The words. If you speak English, you are speaking Rome. Not directly, not purely. English is a Germanic language at its root. Anglo-Saxon and Norse, and the languages of the cold northern peoples who were never quite Roman. But half of English, more than half, is Latin. Every word that ends in tion, every word like civil, legal, public, nation, language, history, memory, empire, Rome. Every time you say vision or mission or tradition or imagination, Rome. Every time you say the word eternal, the word that Rome used to describe itself, still in your mouth, still meaning what it always meant, something that does not end, and perhaps, in some sense that is not quite rational, but is not quite wrong either. It didn't. The girl in the river valley, the one who sat by the water and watched the leaf, she grew up, had children of her own, who had children of their own. The chain of generations running forward through the centuries, through the early medieval world and the Carolingian kingdoms and the slow rebuilding of European civilization and the monasteries preserving knowledge and the universities rediscovering it and the Renaissance reaching back to Rome with newly opened eyes and saying, "Look at this. Look what they made. Look what we came from. All the way forward to now. To you, lying in the dark, in a room built with techniques that trace back, in long and winding ways, to Roman engineers, governed by laws that carry Roman ideas in their structure, like bones carry the shape of their ancestors, speaking words that are Rome's words, mixed with 100 other inheritances into the language you think and without thinking about it at all. You are not separate from that story. You are the next chapter of it. Let that be the last thought. Not a heavy thought, not something to hold or carry, just a light one, like knowing you belong to something larger than yourself, older than yourself, something that has been going on for a very long time and will keep going, with or without anyone knowing. Quietly, the way rivers keep going, the way the seasons keep turning, the way light keeps traveling from its source through the dark, arriving, always arriving, at something waiting to receive it. The forum is quiet tonight. The great stones are cool under the stars. The columns that still stand cast in shadows in the moonlight. Cats, there have always been cats in the forum. For as long as anyone has kept records, move silently among the ruins, attending to their own ancient business. The Colosseum on the hill is dark and enormous and peaceful. Grass grows in its upper tiers. Wildflowers in the spring. The same wildflower that grew in the meadows outside Rome 2,000 years ago, their seeds carried on the same wind. The Tiber moves through the city the way it has always moved. The 7 hills hold the dark and the moonlight and the cats and the wildflowers and the stones and the silence. And somewhere beneath all of it, not metaphorically but literally, layer upon layer the city that was. The foundations of buildings whose names we have forgotten beneath the foundations of buildings whose names we remember beneath the streets of the city that breathes above them now. Rome upon Rome upon Rome, going down and down and down, into the deep earth, into the dark, into the place beyond memory, where everything that has ever existed is resting, quietly, in the permanent dark, together. Sleep now. You have traveled far enough tonight. You have walked the Appian Way in the morning light, and watched the soldier emperors rise and fall like tides, and stewed with Diocletian above the sea, and seen Constantine's candle reflected in the Bosphorus, and felt the ground shift at Adrianople, and heard the gates of Rome open in the dark, and sat with a girl by the river in the autumn light, and watched the boy walk south toward the sea, and held in your hand the strange and quiet fact that Rome is everywhere and nowhere and still, in some sense, here. You can set it all down now. All of it. The weight of 2,000 years. The weight of today. The weight of everything you were carrying when you lay down tonight. Set it all down. It will be there in the morning. Or it won't. Either way, tonight, there's only this. The dark, the quiet, your own breath, slow and easy, moving in and out like a tide, like the sea at Campania where the boy is watching stars, like the Tiber in the moonlight, like everything, rising and falling and rising, and this concludes the story. Sleep well. Good night.